So we are going to spend the next few weeks discussing the rhetorical mode of narrative. Basically, a narrative tells a story. So novels, short stories, and memoirs all fall into this category, though narrative elements can be present in all kinds of writing, like when a writer uses a story to illustrate a concept in an essay intended to explain, or when a personal event functions as an example intended to change an audience's opinion. We're going to read 4 different examples of narrative as we discuss the mode of narration, and those include a comedy routine, a Chaucerian tale, a piece of Gothic horror per se, and a contemporary short story. So I'm going to explain just a few general elements to look for in good narrative, and things that you can point out as you discuss narration and its different elements. First of all is plot, which is crucial to narrative. A plot should be interesting, balanced, and unique. Plot includes both the idea that a story should have a clear beginning, middle, and end, and also that conflict has to exist. So some kind of event has to occur that pits the character or characters against other people, against themselves, against thematic elements, or even a higher force like God. A story can have one conflict or several, depending on its length. Usually a short story will have just one, while a long novel might have many levels of conflict. Generally, conflicts are better when the character resolves them mostly by himself, rather than by an outside force. Sometimes you'll see an instance where a flood or a supernatural event will come in and kind of wipe the problems away. When this occurs, it's often called a deus ex machina, or a God in the machine resolution of conflict. And that term comes from Greek theater, when a divine figure would actually swing onto the stage via some kind of contraption and save the day. And that's thought to be generally a lesser good than when the character actually overcomes his conflict on his own. The second element to examine is the characters in the story. The people in a story will determine a lot about it. Generally, the concept show, don't tell applies to character formation. So it's better if an author demonstrates things about the people by what they actually do than by just stating things about them. Those statements aren't totally taboo, of course, and if you're writing a first-person narrative, the author's impressions are often important, and the narrator's impressions are often important, and those can say, they may say a lot more than they actually show if he's just explaining things as he sees them. In some instances, characters with very extreme personalities are present, particularly in shorter pieces, but generally they're more subtle, and the characters in the Monday story that we'll read in many ways are ideal characters because their personalities are somewhat subtle. Another thing to look for is the setting of a story. Where the event takes place is a significant element in its narrative effect as well. The story depends a good deal on the author's powers of descriptions. He has to be able to show us in words where we are to give us a framework for what's happening. So if you've read Wuthering Heights, for instance, you might remember depictions of the moor and the English countryside, that they do quite a bit towards enhancing the mood of the story. I've recently been interested in a crime drama the BBC has produced called Wallander, which is set in Sweden. And the main character, detective, he lives by the sea, and often visual elements of the show include broad panoramas of the sea and sky as he's driving. It's really lovely and haunting, and it makes a really interesting backdrop for the events. As I was watching that, I was struck more than ever by how important setting can be to a story. Of the stories that we'll read, the music of Eric Zahn and Monday depend quite a bit on setting. The Clerk's Tale and Russell, My Brother, perhaps less so, though you might consider even the setting of what kind of house the characters are residing in To Russell, My Brother. And you might consider elements of medieval life when you consider the Clerk's Tale. So both matters of actual place and of the political or time, a setting behind a story is important as well. And then the last item to think about is the theme and or the moral of the story. And these elements answer the question of what point the story has. Most stories aren't intended to teach a clear moral lesson, though some can, of course. But more often they hint at an idea that causes us to reflect upon the human condition in some way. So we may consider some element about relationships or beauty or love or war or nature from the events that occur, or even from quick reflections that a character has or a subtle remark or exchange that's made somewhere. So as we read The Clerk's Tale, we'll have a chance to reflect on where the moral of a story comes from. Does the author determine it? Do we determine it? There are several different morals proposed for that story. Then an intricate, subtle story like Monday includes a number of different themes, and you could spend a good bit of time trying to tease each of those themes out if you wanted to. So I'll ask you to reflect upon the potential themes of a number of stories that we read as well. So these elements are just a broad overview of what makes up narrative. The explanations I've given here aren't enough to guarantee you a good story if you try to write one based on them. They're just some ideas to guide you towards thinking about how you might describe what a good story does well. And you'll need to be able to do that for our upcoming assignment, which is the narrative analysis essay. So I'd like to explain that to you now. This week and next, we're going to be reading a total of 4 short narrative pieces, listening to one if you count the Cosby. And you'll post on the discussion board each week with some ideas about what you recognize as the strong points of each of these in terms of narrative. In response to these readings, you're also going to write a narrative analysis essay about one of them, whichever one you choose. And in that, you're going to discuss the work as a narrative and identify and explain the elements that make it a successful one. So you'll begin by composing a thesis and an outline, which you'll submit and which we'll give you some feedback on. And then the week following, you'll actually write a complete essay about it, of just about 3 pages or so, not lengthy. So what you should be thinking about for this assignment is, what aspects of the story you choose make it an excellent narrative. You should probably choose just 1 or possibly 2 general topics to discuss. And within them, you're going to want to look closely at a couple more specific elements. So for example, if you choose to describe the setting of one of the stories, you might explain how elements of it create a mood or various moods, how the setting contrasts ironically with the events, or maybe what effect the setting creates for the characters involved. Since this is going to be a short paper, choosing fewer elements is better than choosing too many. When you examine a couple different elements, even within, perhaps one topic, you should seek to find ways that they're connected. Perhaps they have a common effect, they serve a common purpose, or they're used in a way that complements one another. So work carefully to craft a thesis that briefly describes the elements you want to include and links them together in some form. And I call this a roadmap style thesis. It's not really general like the statement, for example, flowers are beautiful, but it's actually more specific where you would say perhaps intricacies of color, scent, and texture make flowers appealing. So for each of your large points that you're going to make in your essay, you want to hint at that in your thesis, and you want it to be one coherent statement. So I'd like you to compose a short thesis and then an outline, and the outline should be very simple. You can use Roman numerals to write simple topic sentences for each of your main points, and then underneath each of your points, you can just list evidence from the text that's going to support your assertions. You should include a couple statements of details from the story to discuss and provide a close reading of them. You're going to look carefully at the ideas of the words and their arrangements and explain why they are what they are and what effect they have. If you write the quotations you find out completely in your outline, you'll be able to include them very easily as you write. You'll also want to list the page numbers or the line numbers. You can go back to them and find them if you need to, and also so I can refer to them if I need to as I grade. You don't need to restate your thesis or write a conclusion as part of the outline. You'll do that later when you have your thoughts together. And I've actually created a document called Writing Spotlight Example Outline just to serve as a guide for this assignment. It's a very simple form. When it comes to writing the actual essay, you'll also want to consider the rubric for writing I gave you the first week for your last essay. Each of those criteria about mechanical elements of essays apply to this as well. And because you'll be writing about an actual story, here's a couple additional things that you should think about for this essay also. The first is textual analysis. For each point you make in this essay, you're going to want to include some evidence from the text, probably a couple examples. That means you should, in most cases, directly quote a line or part of a line that makes your point. It's not enough to just state a point and put a quote beside it, though. After the quotation, you'll have to take a couple sentences to provide your analysis of the quotation. Why is this statement effective? What does it accomplish in terms of the purpose that you say it does? What neat aspects of it are worth describing about the language or the structure of it even? This practice is going to force you to look for and find nuances in the text to describe, and it will keep your work from being too general. Also, you want to be careful not to end any of your paragraphs with quotations. You always want to follow up quotations with your own thoughts that are reflecting on it and that are providing analysis on it. And I've created a writing spotlight called Quotation Integration that has some pointers on actually taking lines of text and putting them into an essay and how to do that. And then in terms of citations for this, you're only going to be referring to one source, and that will be the actual story that you choose in this text. So it'll be very simple to cite them. After each one, I just want you to put the page number, or if you wrote about the Clerk's Tale, you'd use the line number, and you'll put it in parentheses after your quotation mark, your closing quotation mark, but before your period. So please make sure the punctuation is in the right place, or else you drive me crazy when I edit these. Check out some of the examples from other papers if you need to. If you choose to write about the Cosby piece, you can forgo any kind of citation and just put the text you use in quotation marks. Technically, we don't know where it came from exactly, so I'll just know that it's there somewhere. Technically, you would need to cite whatever text you used in a bibliography, but for this assignment, I know exactly where each of these texts came from, and I haven't even given you all that information. So you do not need to write a bibliography. We will talk about how to write a works cited page for several essays that we will do later in the year. So just parentheses with your page numbers included are all you'll need here. After you write your essay next week, you will exchange it with another student, and you'll be sure to send them your draft, which they will use a peer-reviewed checklist to examine, and they will use the comment function in Word to make notes on, and they'll exchange that back to you. And I'll be in touch with details about that as well. So happy writing as you begin this, and if you have questions as you write, please be in touch with me about them as well.